Hello, everyone. It's nice to have you all here. And so this is, I guess, our first in earnest meeting. Some of us were able to attend an earlier meeting where we were sort of working out some of the logistics, and we thought it was decided that a best way to approach this book is to go chapter by chapter. We weren't sure initially if we would confine ourselves to one chapter. We initially thought we'd start with chapter 2, but we've rethought that, and we're going to begin with chapter 1, the introduction. And I sent out some questions that I thought could start the discussion. And so if everyone's comfortable, we could begin right there with the title to the introduction, which is Farewell to Humanity's Childhood. And it struck me as what they're setting out to do, of course, is that they're making the point that the time is ripe to really assess a lot of the new literature, scholarly literature on antiquity and prehistory that challenges a lot of these conventional assumptions about human existence. And so they're contending that now is a good time for us to put aside this infantile conception of human history. And so it made me wonder, how might we consider human history in ways that avoid teleologies, and teleologies being these stories that, as we narrate them, we fall into the trap of being in a trap of narration. And what the two Davids maintain is that scholars are a product of the very institutions that mold them, and that they have subscribed largely to an idea of human existence that assumes a primordial equal, or a primordial equality, a social equality, and that's really not the best question, and that it reduces narratives to teleologies because there's already this social evolution built into it. So how might we consider history in ways that acknowledge change and continuity simultaneously without privileging a certain kind of narrative a construct that's prefigured? Obviously, I don't have any answers to that myself, but this is really, I think, the question that they start out with is, how can we write a history that's fair to the evidence, but also speculative in nature, so that we can attend to the possibilities and the surprises that the human past seems to be telling us? Nika.
Yeah, I also want to say that I think one of the major outcome of the book could be that it will break out of the debates that happens between left and right wing people. Yeah, so because left is like Rousseauian and right wing is Hobbesian, and they all kind of fighting each other over the human nature. So if we suddenly start to believe that there is no such a thing as human nature, then the whole political debate will totally change, like completely. And then the other thing I want to say, that one of the achievements of Occupy Wall Street was an introduction in the, at least American, but all around the world, to debate of inequality. Suddenly, to be in debt, to be poor, stop being such a curse at least ideologically. So politicians start to say, oh, we have to reduce inequality and blah, blah, blah. And so, you know, just to attack the notion of inequality in this book, that was such a brave and brilliant move, I think, you know, it's just really, really amazing. So I also think it's very much about shaping upcoming political debate of our times, and hopefully we will see lots of changes in everything, starting from, you know, political parties and how we constitute ourselves. So that's very exciting.
Yeah, one of the articles that previewed this argument, it appeared in French, and part of the title is "The Birth of the Left," and I'll be honest, I don't know how convinced I am, how persuaded I am that the left, that the line from Rousseau to social science, to leftism, to social science, etc., is as strong as the two Davids suggest. I'm still thinking through that one. That's what I like about the argument, though, is because they're really challenging the left to look at how they have framed questions in particular ways. And so, you know, David's work had already disrupted the ideas of vanguardism, but now he's really, you know, going against the entire project of the left. And so it's very, I mean, it's provocative, and I'm still personally uncomfortable with it.
But why? Why are you uncomfortable? Because it's like not really a leftist project, and I think they writing, like he's explaining it very well, because that's the very idea that humans has, you know, this kind of good nature, make us, and the idea of paradise that was set in the beginning of humanity, this lost Eden, is just kind of actually stop any revolution. So nothing is possible. We have to just wait when things are getting better. I think Simona is coming. I just came now, and I really like your comment, your tweet. Hey, Simona.
Hey.
Hey.
I have a better connection that I expected.
Yeah, I was just talking about your
there's
tweet.
no.
I was just talking. Sorry? I was just talking about your tweet that I really like. The tweet about the real, what is really behind the new book. Maybe I will just read it out loud. We'll find it now. Well, you can tell it, like it's. I think it was brilliant. Do you hear?
Sorry, I need to put some headphones.
Yeah, I just can read.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. So Simone was tweeted that the battle fight of the dawn of everything is not so much about historian revision as it is about getting rid of the illusion of the one-shot revolution that takes us back to a single ideal past. So I think it's really summarized the problem. So if we think that there is no single ideal past and there is no single human nature, then everything would be different, like including our practical steps of how we can live right now. So I think that was like very short and very brilliant kind of summary of the whole book. So I think the summary of the revision of the history is more like the argument. And that's why David was really happy to work with David Wengrow, who is an archaeologist, who can provide a real, backup for all these crazy thoughts. Because if you can prove that, 1,000 years ago, here and there, like really things happens differently than we read in the textbooks, then the whole history is different. But then history is different, then life right now is also would be different. So that's what really excites me about this text.
Just one comment to Steve. I wouldn't say that. I don't know if it really counts as an attack on the left per se. That word means lots of different things, obviously, and the specific origin of the word left in the modern times comes from some kind of parliamentary thing. I think in France, where a group of people were all on the left that supported a particular position. But again, that's the type of people who care about each other, and you would have gone back to the Roman Senate and found the same thing. But the kind of the attack on Rousseau as an image of the left, I think that's been going on slightly longer because like Rudolf Rocker, as an anarchist writer, writes in the early 20th century about Rousseau's problems. And I think probably during the French Revolution, Rousseau's work was used to kind of impose a bourgeois revolution upon the people. Like Rudolf Rocker talks about Rousseau as the use of Rousseau. So Rousseau says there can only be one nation. The revolution only has one revolution. You can't have a revolution within. And so the first thing after the French Revolution, these workers' collectives set up, and they get told you're illegal because you're a revolution inside the revolution. So the workers' collectives were basically told that they were counter-revolutionary by the employers' part of the revolution.
I would like to.
Yes.
So Steve's question actually is taking me out in a whole different direction. So the idea how to avoid teleology, which seems to be also what underpins the two Davids reasoning in the first chapter. I have the sensation that I read the first two actually, that I had the sensation they're setting the stage, but the meat of their argument is still to come. So I'm very curious about the third and fourth. And I started thinking about the idea of evolution when we know how it works. It starts out with hunter-gatherers, then agriculture is, quote, discovered, and so on through various stages, all the way to capitalist society. And I think this was actually something that was discovered. It was the product of people actually looking at evidence and finding that somehow one thing led to another. But maybe one argument against teleology is that hunter and gatherer societies are not doomed to become agricultural or destined. Whether we take the Hobbesian or the Rousseau outlook on this, and the same goes for all subsequent stages. But it's also true that societies have become agricultural, evolving from what we call the hunter-gathering stage in different parts of the world independently. I think that's an important consideration. So when the one thing does not lead necessarily to another, but there are certain there are certain trends, and I think that's not teleology. I think there's a serious argument that there are certain forces that I wouldn't call that human nature. I would call that just the way human society and the way human beings relate to their environment and the constraints they have to deal with and how they react to them. And so you have agriculture invented, which is not really an invention, of course, because hunter and gatherers knew that if you dropped a seed in the ground, a plant would sprout. Of course they knew. They knew their environment inside out, but it is the social decision to rely for subsistence mainly on agriculture. That's something that came up in different parts of the world independently. So teleology is seeing only one narrative, the one that leads to us. That's definitely teleology, but that's only one path. And this is a very incomplete thought, but that's just what I've been thinking about so far.
I'm just thinking of the changes in my lifetime. That when I was, I'm slightly older than David would have been, but when I was young, there weren't as many books, and things like Rousseau or Hobbes were books you could buy in Penguin Classics, and they were almost treated like living writers you could engage with. And in those days, we were at the end of much widespread belief in Christianity. So you had all of that teleology and seeing where we were going in a very theological context. Whereas now, I think, there are more books and there's more thinking, but most people have less time to read, I think. Many people in any kind of professional job under neoliberalism are worked off their feet, as anyone under neoliberalism, to the point where they don't have time to sit and read texts very much. I can do it because I'm more or less retired. And so almost the idea of taking them as serious exemplars seems to be something of a slightly past era. I'm also remembering that Bertrand Russell, I remember reading his History of Western Philosophy, wasn't, I think, terribly impressed by either of them. So I can't remember exactly what he said. So in that sense, it may be that we are in a position where we can construct a new narrative that isn't quite as simplistic or great man-like as the earlier ones. The thing that fascinated me about the chapter is the quotation at the very beginning from Jung. Because whatever possessed Jung to say that was probably an entirely different chain of causality to anything else, anything discussed in the chapter. In Jung's case, it could well have been ancient Gnosticism or something. It may be, I think it's a very apt quote, but it's a different time frame of causality.
Okay. If I may, if there's nobody else who wants to talk, I think the idea the two Davids are fighting is that of progress and progress in human evolution. The very idea of an evolution of what comes later being better than what comes before, and of European civilization being better than other civilizations. I think David's work, David Graeber's work, I'm starting to put the pieces of us together, and I think the main idea is to show the many possibilities of human beings, how there is no direction, no progress, and no progress, and no regress, no direction in human history, and instead many possibilities in history that is our product, and as such can be changed in a way, can be changed at in as much we understand the frames, the parts, the ways humans relate to each other and build societies among them. As you may know, I love the idea of carnival, and it struck me that when students talk about how better societies can be, where actually in the history, they say a carnival of different experiments. They stress the idea of experiment and possibilities, and this, in my opinion, to
Can I say something? Steve, maybe you moderate, so you will tell people when
Sure,
they can.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, Mika, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah. So yeah, I totally agree with Simona that it's against progress, of course, and it's in this case we do need to read Benjamin Walter Benjamin and Frankfurt School and so on. But it's interesting that Benjamin was like a very depressive person and suicidal, and David was really cheerful. And one of the reason to write this book is to find a path for us to hope for something, and to have a real kind of possibility. That's why they always use this word possibilities every other sentence. So it's a kind of notion of no progress, not in a way that there is no better world coming up, but the very idea of progress of being regressive, because it was used in the Soviet Marxism and all this deterministic ideas about human nature, whatever it's mean, like fascist mean one thing by human nature, Soviet means other things, but the whole notion was destructive actually. So yeah, I think it's definitely in this case against progress, as for example the notion of progress as I grew up with. But I also wanted to come back to the second question that Steven asked us, is about enlightenment, because for me it's I don't understand that actually. So it's about enlightenment kind of limiting our possibilities of imagination. And it's something about science here that's coming back again to what I'm always trying to figure out, Roy Bhaskar, and I'm reading now this book about history of magic. That's also, looks like it's a two different description of the world. one is like the Western science born in Enlightenment, and another where everything is measured, and you know, we can definitely know what is this and what is that and what happens in each minute. And then it's another is like this magical ideas. Like I just read this chapter about Chinese magic, and the ideas relation to the time, when the time was very relative, and there was no units of time that you can say, but it's all was about like what number was assigned to this, you know, and how this number correlate to, you know, month and planet and whatever else, like 10,000 other things. And the idea that we're not only controlled by the world, but also we giving back to the world. We are like, we can affect it. Depends on what we do, the world will be different. And yeah, and that's looks like in this first chapter, that's exactly what are they writing about. I don't know, Steve, maybe you can comment on your second question.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things that is so fascinating about the epistemology that they've put together. And because it's, you know, it's a social theory of action, and they define action as human actions are human actions that aren't able to be predicted. So, you know, David has written elsewhere about really, you know, what makes life most magical or most worth living are the surprises. And so it's an epistemology that is built on surprise rather than you know, some other kind of presupposition. So they're actually trying to construct a narrative based around, or at least my read of it, based around about moments where there are alternatives, or times when societies or civilizations get stuck, but that they have within them the means still to surprise, because so long as someone's human, they're capable of being unpredictable. But when we become stuck, that's when we lose our humanity. So that made me then think, okay, they're critiquing Rousseau and Hobbes and Enlightenment thinking notions of progress. So why then, what is it about Enlightenment thinking, modernist thinking, capitalist thinking that simultaneously limits our imagination, but we're creating a world that seems to be more complex? And so that paradox is something that has long fascinated me. It's also a question that in interviews, David Graeber wrestled with explicitly, where he even said, you know, why is it, despite the second law of thermodynamics, does it seem that the universe rather, has gotten more complex? And his answer to that was, because humans play.
Maybe I can ask Michael. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to say the answer is yes. I would, if he were here, I'd want to say more, say more.
Maybe I will ask Michael about Enlightenment, and in, you know, because you're studying history or teaching history of science, and so maybe you can explain, at least I have a question about simplification and, you know, reduction, that's basically all all Western science looks like, is using as a methodology to find out things, find out these laws that like nature have, and then control them, and how it's somehow connected to our ideas of social structures as well. Am I right?
I mean, just in terms of the early Enlightenment was kind of a battle between who gets to make knowledge, because the epistemology, if you want to use a fancy word, was how do you know what's true? You ask the king, you ask the priest, you ask your authority figures, right? That's what Hobbes claims you should do if you want to know what happens. And so the early sort of sciences came out of working people who were trying to build things and experimenting with them, right? And then so the people who said, well, we don't have to just ask authority figures, we can figure out ourselves, we can work together with other people. They saw the Enlightenment as very enlightening and creating a process where more people were engaged, right? There was kind of a longer term deal where during the English Civil War, the new science process started up, and the aristocrats who wanted some science, but they didn't want to they wanted to make sure that legitimate people were in charge of it. They made a deal, and they said the experimental process should have modest witnesses, was the term that Boyle used. And a modest witness had to be male and kind of aristocratic. If you were poor or a working person, you couldn't be trusted to be a witness because somebody could have just paid you money. Only an aristocrat could be a proper witness. And they modeled it off to the law, the Treason Act in the Civil War. That Treason Act said in order to accuse someone of treason, you had to have 3 witnesses, and they had to have these legitimate characteristics. So it's basically the Homeland Security Act of the English Civil War that the scientists based their witnessing on. Now, of course, as the Enlightenment has progressed, there was more and more people who got to be engaged as scientists and be counted as witnesses. But even today, you've got to get a PhD to count as a scientist. You've got to put it through your deal. To get a PhD in the UK, you've got to pay £9,000 a tuition term. It's not for just anybody to get to be important to do science. That doesn't mean science hasn't had a really progressive effect, but it has been kind of qualified and slowed down. In the Newton age, science was equivalent to industry. So Isaac Newton sort of talked about industry and how to be efficient. And there was a huge application of science just by employers to try to make people work more efficiently. So again, when you take the rationality and apply it from one person or a few people or wealthy people's perspective, then you kind of take away that liberatory value of science. And so many people complain endlessly that science needs to be democratized in many more ways. And it's been an issue. So instead of being anti-science or anti-progress, which is probably quite a problematic position, one wants to also talk about democratizing science, democratizing progress, opening up the opportunities, opening up science to more scrutiny from more people, making sure expertise isn't a small group of people who only have expertise because they're wealthy and got an education. There's lots of people who have expertise because they are in a community, right? The government couldn't figure out how to deal with, during the pandemic, with poverty that was going on, and lots of people in their communities got hold of food and distributed it themselves. That was an expertise in how the community works and runs, done by the community. So that's kind of the challenge of an enlightenment, which is both an image of progress because everybody got to be included, but it also was a limitation of progress because they wanted to make sure that that expertise didn't include everybody. So the Enlightenment becomes an ongoing battle with, if you just apply a scientific rationality, it takes away the care, which is an important part of how we know things and how we know they're valuable to us in our communities.
Nika, you had a question?
Yeah, I just
Oh.
wanted to ask if the whole idea of experiment and some objectivity of science come as a kind of tools to democratize it, because if you don't rely on the aristocratic male to verify it, you have to rely on something, and maybe they rely on, you know, some objective reality like experiment or something like this. Again, about the book that I'm reading now, History of Magic, they have a very different tools to decide what is true and what is not true. That doesn't have anything to do with like repeated experiments and so on. But also it was not necessarily this hierarchical system, because the magic in the different community could be performed by the different groups, like some kind of insane people could be magical or stuff like that. So so my question about enlightenment is it a kind of correlation historically that at the same time it's become democratization of social hierarchy, and we use this reduction and simplification in order to democratize our knowledge process? Am I understood correctly, you, Michael?
Well, I mean, I think the term enlightenment was an overall kind of political term connected to who gets to make knowledge, and knowledge becoming a more collective enterprise. So people didn't, people could challenge religious authority. The specific experimental process is always in debate, and it's different for different types of science. But I mean, the obvious principle is you can't just, it's not just democratic, we can all vote to say what happens. It's we have to interact with the world, the phenomenon that people are studying, and people can debate what's going on there and come up with something, but how you interpret that phenomenon will have some kind of, different people will interpret it a different way, and so you want to democratize that interpretation. But it's quite, but in some way, so I kind of steer away from saying, well, the facts are just out there, we'll find the objective truth, because if you look at, say, atomic physics, what are the facts? Well, should you build nuclear weapons? Should you use nuclear power? Are there useful things like telecommunication devices that we can learn from quantum mechanics that build a television, or you allow us to use computers and talk to each other? Those are all things you can do with it, and you can debate about the facts and what is the best way to use knowledge about those things. I don't know, does that help with the question a little bit? I mean, I certainly think.
Not really, because you didn't answer. So so my understanding of like contemporary science, it's not only science, it's not only physics, it's not only natural sciences, it's also social sciences. For example, we have an economics that tell us, you know, what is money and how we should live and so on. And it looks like it's using the same methodology of reduction and, you know, experiments and so on. And that's obviously not working, and it's become magic. Yeah, so economics is a magical science now. So it looks like it's all started in Enlightenment, maybe, and it's looks like it started as an attempt of democratization and getting power away from religious authorities, but in the same time, maybe this science become religion itself now, you know, because
And
that
certainly with economics, that seems very much the case, that you end up with, and many types of sciences, people like to give authority to their knowledge. So instead of saying the king told me this, they say science told me this, and you're not able to ask any questions. So science becomes a new sort of king. And then once you go to explore its method to say, well, what was the method? Then it becomes very complicated, and lots of people are just convinced, oh, that's too complicated for me. I'll just ask the scientists. And that's again and again, when you engage with the public about democratizing science, they just get nervous and say, that's very complicated. Well, some of it is, honestly, but like that doesn't mean that there aren't debates to be held and more public engagement with what we want to use science to do.
But I just want to say even something more desperate, because it's not only that scientists is like trying to hold on power and not allowing public debate. It's also the nature of invention. Look at artificial intelligence, for example. This is a machine that's built in a way that we cannot possibly understand, because look how like how mechanism in Facebook working. It's a layers and layers of the software that's all interact with each other, and there is no overall design that we can kind of, you know, change, because some kind of coder, like one of the many thousands of people who's working for Facebook, just change some part of the application, and then suddenly, you know, millions of people started to get depressing news. Like, you know, but nobody, like the director of the Facebook cannot find out why is that and how to change it, because you know, these computers are talking to each other. This is like the nature of the machine itself. It doesn't have this simple design as a printing press, for example. So maybe it's not only about only about how we can be better, and this is in this case exists a good solution for the science, but maybe science itself kind of, you know, more complex social activity than Enlightenment was telling us in the beginning, that we just can get rid of the, you know, king, and instead use experiment and pattern, and then everybody can control it. I don't know, maybe I'm wrong. Am I?
I mean, I mean, lots of people could have an opinion on this as much as me, but I would agree that science is moving into a different phase. I mean, it normally moves through different phases, different ideas about how you can better get knowledge. And the algorithm is a new method for gathering knowledge, which doesn't necessarily rely upon what you can, you know, what you can definitely prove through a rational or a geometric theorem. And so it's like an effective guess, but sometimes it doesn't seem that effective.
Axel,
May
would you
I
like
jump in on this,
Oh,
or?
yeah. Well, I wanted to give Axel a chance because I know her hand was up
Sure.
earlier.
Sure.
Hi, I think I'll wait to chime in. I had a random thought based on something that Michael was talking about a little earlier that's like related to the question number one. And I don't want to detract from this conversation, so I'll hop back in after this moment.
Thank you, very generous. Matthew, I also saw that your hand was up.
Yeah, sure. I feel like
I was just going to ask if now's a good time to jump in, or if not.
Yeah, I mean, it's what I have to say is I don't know about, like, is in response to this last sort of topic of conversation, which is that maybe one way to think about the Enlightenment was a transition from appeal to authority as like rhetorical legitimacy. This is to appeal to haha, I told you so, as like as a like tool of rhetorical legitimacy, where sort of if you're able to, like, sort of the way that science works is you come up with a story that allows you to make predictions. And so if you're able to make consistently accurate predictions, you can say, haha, I told you so. And you say that often enough, and then people eventually start listening to you when your predictions continue to be right over and over and over again. And one of the things that might explain why economics is so bad at being a science is it's so hard to run the experiments. Like, it's hard to set up like here is my theory, here is my thing, let's try it out, because the guinea pigs are hundreds and hundreds of thousands of humans. And so it ends up sort of devolving into like trying to take its cues much more from mathematics, of an axiomatic system of, we are coming up with, these are our beliefs about the world, and we're going to extrapolate out from them into a system that describes this. And, you know, a lot of those axioms of things like humans are fundamentally rational beings that always act in their own best interest are just nonsense. And so what you have is like a, you know, beautiful, you know, castle in the sky built on no foundation, or built on very shaky foundations. And again, taking its cues much more from mathematics than from science, which personal feeling is much better at coming up with, you know, what it comes up with is stories that allow you to make predictions. And then it becomes a much more philosophical conversation about whether those stories reflect, like, are true. Like that becomes a philosophical conversation. What it's very good at is coming up with stories that allow you to make predictions about the world. I mean, that's what an experiment is the prediction that I came up with from this story what actually happened. So yeah, so that, I feel like, I don't know how much that answers the question, but I feel like might help like meld that a little bit better.
Rika, were you wanting to jump in?
May I?
Yes, please.
Oh, no, I'm mainly a listener, and I'm very grateful to Simona for having gotten me involved in this and revealed to me the existence of this thinker, whom I consider, I mean, I love any thinker who can say that, title a chapter, he says, the conventional narrative of human history is not only wrong, but quite needlessly dull. That attracts me a great deal. I would like to have known this man, and I'm going to read his books. And so I'm grateful to Simona. Unfortunately, I have, for today's meeting, only read the first chapter. And so I think that I'd like to read more, and I hope that I can get hold of the rest of the book. One of the things I found in the first chapter, which I think might come to, in part, and to answer or respond to Nika Dubrovsky's remark is I have it here before me. I'll read it. It's very brief. He says, as a result, I'm talking about David Graeber. As a result, he writes, all real progress in social science has been rooted in the courage to say things that are, in the final analysis, slightly ridiculous. The work of Karl Marx, Sigmund Freud, or Claude Lévi-Strauss being only particularly salient cases in point. This is certainly a backhanded compliment, but I think there's something complimentary about it as well. As if, now I very respectful of science for the reasons that Matthew Gray has pointed out. I consider it a wonderful tool. And when we speak of the democratization of science, I think the question that, if that's to make sense, and I think Michael Reinsborough does want to make sense out of it, is that, you know, you ask the question, well, who's paying you? You know, that's a big question, you know, and in a society like ours, it is the question. And I think that's one way to take a critical stance towards science, because there's a lot of science that's going around. Science is not a theological word to me. And I'm saying theological, not theological. It is, to some extent, it's theological, but it's not a religion. You know, there's scientific racism. There are all sorts of sciences that have been going on. And so but it is a wonderful tool. It certainly is a wonderful tool, but there are others that are very good. And some of them are things like poetry and music. And I don't know where I'm going with this, but in any case, I'm very grateful to Simona having to introduce me to David Graeber. And I think I'll go back to where I was. Thank you.
I love the quote that you found, because it answers a question that I wonder how people wrestle with, and that is to, you know, the book is very critical of social science and says that most of social science has started from the wrong sorts of questions, and that intellectual scholars have occupied themselves, policymakers in particular, have used science to really promote reformist goals that are starting from these unimaginative or dull questions. And so hearing the word ridiculous used alongside social science is, you know, I think really a wonderful thing, because it basically admits what a lot of policymakers and economists in particular don't want to admit, and that is that their predictions really at bottom aren't any better than anyone else's, statistically speaking. And that's not to say that science doesn't have a value. As Federico said, I agree. I'm in concert with his take there. But that if we think of an epistemology built around a social theory of action where surprises and unpredictability are the basis of humanity, then it means that we really need to be looking for constant surprise rather than, well, not rather than, in addition to, I think, the predictability that science does offer. Because yes, science does offer predictability, but that predictability can also be demonstrated by the way that kings, their power is predictable, and that is, you know, if you have enough people who believe that you're the king, then you are the king. And so, yeah, there is this weird, Graeber said it was, you know, why is it that the unpredictability is mysterious? But why should we be surprised that it's mysterious, I think is the way he's asked the question in the past. The book, I think the connection, I don't know Roy Bhaskar's work well, but to me it seems the connection that the two Davids are trying to make is to using science to emancipate, but by relying on simplifications, which are inevitable, there's a way that predictability can be used in emancipatory ways, and there are ways that it can be used to constrain. And that earlier societies, I'm jumping ahead a bit, but they're going to show us that earlier societies were aware of the implications of scientific innovation, and that they knew that those were avenues to avoid, because they could, scientific innovation could lend itself to hierarchy. And that's when people would become historically stuck, when they would assume that predictability in one realm makes for predictability in another realm. And I mean, we see this in politics where typically they're older white dudes who become really rich, and they think because they're really rich, because they've succeeded in that avenue, in that game, that they can succeed in a lot of other games that societies play when the rules needn't apply universally in these different games, but we tend to think of society as one game, the economy as one game, politics as one game, when really there are myriad games going on.
Michael wanted to say something.
Michael.
Yeah, because so I haven't read this whole book. I just read this chapter, and it seems very similar to, there was I just put this in the chat. So this is kind of a foreshadow article that was out there, and it summarizes a lot of the things, although it doesn't, this short article doesn't have the stuff on the Native American constitutions that presumably are going to be part of chapter 2. But a lot of that stuff was also written in the end of one of his other books, actually the book on democracy, the Democracy Project, and stuff. So, but like, just going back to kind of Steve's questions, what might have, this sort of farewell to humanity's childhood, and this image of the noble savage is really what he seems to be making fun of in this farewell. Saying that actually many of these people hundreds of years ago really actually were quite sophisticated socially. Even if they weren't clever enough to build atomic weapons, they might have been clever enough not to build atomic weapons. But more importantly, they knew how social relations worked. And I'm taken by one particular story. They're very suggestive, and I hope the book has more on this, about a city that was set up, and the archaeologists had found it, and there was no palaces in the city. It's almost entirely a city with buildings the same size where everybody shares. So like a large city that has equality sort of built into it, which is sort of unknown in the sort of Rousseau and Hobbes story, that somehow you can't have equality in a large scale structure. They had another story where they had a tribe which during one part of the year, they came together as great hunts, and they all lived in an egalitarian society with big tents. And another part of the year, they were in small groups that were run patriarchally by hunter leaders. Right, which was a bit of an odd, the hunter-gatherer bit was actually more patriarchal, and the group bit was all gathered. But the point they were making was that these people had a direct experience of two different social structures or social organizations, and so they could make real choices about politics, but also understand how their environment, their social environment, the choices they've made, in some sense, the science they used or the infrastructure or the culture that they built materially had an impact on them politically. And so the argument being that humanity's childhood is not what simple people were, the sort of prehistorical people were. Prehistorical people were actually quite sophisticated about social relationships and made real choices. And this is backed up also by a lot of stuff there's a book by a fellow named Scott, who's a geographer, who's wrote this book called Against the Grain. And it summarizes a lot of the contemporary sociology of the state that says that many of the early states were just these hierarchical experiments that could happen because they had grain that they could use for money, and somebody got hold of the grain and could control it. But they often fell apart, and people fled these kind of totalitarian experiments. And the argument I think I've seen Graeber write at other places is that when the North Americans showed up in when the Europeans showed up in North America, they discovered a group of people who in recent history had dealt with one of these totalitarian states and it had collapsed. And they were now all very careful about building these constitutions to prevent, totalitarianism. And that had a huge influence on Rousseau, on all these people in the Europe, and it actually influenced all of Western culture. But they didn't want to talk about it, and they called these people simple savages because that was their image. They didn't have gunpowder, So.
Axel?
Yeah, so this is kind of like tying back to my random thought from Michael earlier too. So Michael was talking about during the pandemic, regular folks feeding each other and that type of mutual aid and care. And so I'm thinking about in chapter 1, when the Davids are talking about indigenous societies and how they cared for one another, and they really wanted to make sure that no one went without food and that sort of thing. And so I'm thinking that that's potentially related to ideas of the history of humanity and progress in evolution related to Peter Kropotkin's mutual aid ideas, and how species who support one another survive. And so I'm wondering if survival can be considered a teleological end. So I think, yeah, so just a jumble of thoughts related to that.
Robin, would you like to chime in?
Thank you. Going back to the point about who can be an authority, as when we're discussing early science, it struck me that halfway between the Enlightenment and now, you had the viewpoint put forward by the Church of England under aristocratic control was that their clergy weren't beholden to their parishioners or to anyone else to pay them. They didn't have to demean themselves in trade, so they could give the objective truth. And this was at the time when there was a revival of Druidry, and the response of the Druids and people like them was to put in their will the clause that no paid priest may officiate at my funeral, which I always thought was an awesome thing to say.
Yeah, I wanted to, that's an amazing point. That I wasn't aware of that. I've never heard that. I wanted to also comment on Axel's point about mutual aid. David Graeber, it probably was the last thing he wrote, the introduction to the illustrated, new illustrated edition of mutual aid. And he concludes the intro by saying it's incumbent on people to write a history of humanity that puts mutual aid as the central illuminated factor explaining human development. And that if you think of what historians have done since the discipline of history really started during the Enlightenment, if you think, well, I mean, I guess you could go back to Greece, ancient, but then it's, hagiography. Yes, we're going to finish up. Just that most histories have looked at either conflict as a factor, class conflict being the factor that explains social development, and that Kropotkin really put forth this idea that mutual aid should be the main category. So let's finish up there. It was great seeing everyone. I like the schedule of every 2 weeks. I hope that works better so that we have time. I mean, these are meaty chapters. So I will send around the next installment, which is chapter 2. And of course, anything that comes up in this chat, and you want to sort of park it in the parking lot and bring it up for the next one, that's all, I think, fair game. So thank you, and we'll see you again next go around.
And I will put this video under protection and send it around to the mailing list. So the people from the mailing list who happen not to be able to see, they can catch up with us for the next time.
Thank you.
All right.
Bye, everybody.
Does anyone want to stay for just a second and chat about that other thing that we're putting
Yeah,
together?
let's do that.
I will. I will
Yes, yes,
stay.
Me too. Me too.
Yeah, so we're putting together another discussion group during the London Anti-University, a reading thing. So if you want to help out with that.
Michael, are you a New Englander?
Yeah, I grew up in Maine, yeah.
I understood that. I'm from Boston, near Boston.
Amazing.
I heard
Hear it in the
your
way I say it.
idea.
Yeah. What do you call a deer with no eyes?
Like Kennedy with Cuba and Asia.
Yeah,
Okay.
I don't hear it myself, but everybody else gets it wrong. If I listen carefully, I can tell everybody else is saying it wrong.
That's good. On the other hand, we have mother and father. Okay, I'm sorry, just a linguistic comment. It's been so nice to be with you, and I look forward to the next meeting. Thanks, Simona. Thanks to all of you. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Yeah. Do we need to record this bit, or we're just?
Oh
gonna
yeah, we
talk?
should just
Yeah,
stop
let me
it.
turn that off.
Uh-huh.